I spent 15 years supporting my husband through medical school and residency, putting my dreams on hold. After he finally became a surgeon and I asked about starting my degree, he announced he's been cheating with a nurse and wants divorce. My in-laws say I'm only worth community property since I was just the help. When I met David in my sophomore year of college, I thought I'd found my forever person. We were both 19, idealistic, and had big dreams. I was studying literature with dreams of becoming a professor, while he was pre-med with aspirations of becoming a surgeon. We fell hard and fast for each other, spending long nights talking about our futures and how we'd support each other's ambitions. By our senior year, we were engaged. David had been accepted to medical school, and I was considering PhD programs in English literature. That's when we had to make our first major decision as a couple. Medical school was expensive, and David's parents could only contribute so much. Student loans would cover tuition, but living expenses in the city where his medical school was located would be tight on loans alone. We sat down together and made what I thought was a joint decision. I would put my PhD plans on hold and work full-time to support us while David attended medical school. The plan was that once he finished his residency and became established as a surgeon, I would finally pursue my own academic dreams. It made sense at the time, his earning potential was higher, and medical training had a clear timeline. My academic path could be more flexible. So we got married after graduation in a small ceremony, moved to the city where David's medical school was located, and I found a job as an administrative assistant at a local company. The pay wasn't great, but combined with David's loans, we could afford a tiny one-bedroom apartment and modest living expenses. I told myself it was temporary, just 4 years until he finished medical school. Those 4 years were hard but manageable. I worked 9 to 5 while David spent long hours studying and at the hospital. I handled all the cooking, cleaning, and household management so he could focus on his studies. When he'd come home exhausted after 36-hour shifts, I'd have hot food waiting in a clean apartment where he could crash. I proofread his papers, quizzed him on anatomy, and created elaborate study guides to help him prepare for exams. When David graduated from medical school, I was bursting with pride. We'd done it. But then came the news that residency would be another 5 years for his surgical specialty. The pay for residence was better than nothing, but still barely enough to live on in an expensive city. Once again, we sat down to discuss our options. Just a few more years, David promised. Once I'm through residency, you can go back to school, and I'll support you the way you've supported me. I believed him. I loved him. So I continued working, now as an executive assistant with better pay. David's residency hours were even more grueling than medical school. 80-hour weeks were the norm, with some stretching to 100 hours during particularly intense rotations. Some nights, I'd only see him for 15 minutes before he collapsed into bed, exhausted. Our friends from college moved forward with their lives while ours seemed suspended in this holding pattern. My college roommate completed her PhD and secured a tenure-track position at a university. Other friends bought houses, had children, traveled. I watched it all from the sidelines, telling myself that our time would come. My parents worried I was sacrificing too much. Don't lose yourself in his dreams, my mother cautioned. But I reassured her that we were a team, that David's success would ultimately be our success, that my turn would come. 5 years of residency turned into 7 when David decided to do a fellowship in a highly specialized area of surgery. This will set me up for the best positions, he explained. The job market is competitive, and this will give me an edge. I supported this decision too, though by now I was 30 years old and increasingly anxious about my own stalled career plans. But I continued working, continued keeping our home running, continued believing in our shared future. Finally, 15 years after we'd made our initial agreement, David completed his training. He was offered a position as an attending surgeon at a prestigious hospital with an excellent salary. At last, I thought, my turn had come. I spent weeks researching PhD programs in our area. I updated my academic CV, reached out to potential advisors, and drafted my statement of purpose. I was excited but also nervous. It had been so long since I'd been in an academic environment. Would I still have what it takes? But I was ready to find out. One evening, I prepared a special dinner to celebrate David's first month as an attending and to discuss my plans for applying to graduate programs. I'd taken the day off work to cook his favorite meal and set up our tiny dining area with candles and wine. I was practically bursting with excitement about finally moving forward with my own dreams. David came home later than expected, looking tired but also somehow agitated. He barely noticed the special dinner setup. When I poured him a glass of wine and started talking about the PhD programs I was considering, he barely made eye contact. "What's wrong?" I finally asked, my excitement deflating. He set down his fork, took a deep breath, and delivered the words that would shatter my world. "I've been seeing someone else. A nurse from the hospital. It's been going on for about 8 months." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. 8 months. While I was researching programs and planning our next phase of life together, he'd been building a relationship with someone else. I want a divorce, he continued, his voice oddly detached. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'll be moving out this weekend. I don't remember much of what was said after that. There was shouting, crying from me, not him, and desperate questions that received clinical, prepared answers. It was like he'd rehearsed this conversation, anticipated all my reactions, and had ready responses that revealed nothing and gave me no satisfaction. The next few days passed in a blur. David packed his things methodically and moved out while I was at work, leaving his keys on the kitchen counter. I learned from social media that the nurse he'd been seeing was named Melissa, that she was 27, 9 years younger than me, and that she'd apparently already moved in with him into a new condo he'd purchased without my knowledge. The betrayal was total. Not just the affair, but the deliberate planning, the secrets, the fact that he'd clearly been making arrangements for his new life while I was still fully invested in our shared future. When the divorce paperwork arrived, I was shocked to see how aggressive his demands were. Despite 15 years of marriage, during which I had financially supported him through medical school and residency while putting my own career aspirations on hold, he was arguing that I deserved only the bare minimum of community property, essentially half of our meager joint assets, which amounted to little since most of our money had gone toward his education and living expenses. There was no acknowledgement of the enormous investment I had made in his career, no proposal to help me finally get my own education, nothing that indicated any recognition of my sacrifice. The document read as if I'd been a roommate who'd paid my fair share, not a spouse who had devoted her entire adult life to supporting his ambitions. I was fortunate to have a friend whose sister was a divorce attorney. She agreed to take my case and explained that in our state, I had a strong claim to spousal support given the length of our marriage and the fact that I had supported David through his education with the expectation that I would later be supported through mine. This is actually a textbook case, she explained. The courts generally recognize that when one spouse supports the other through professional education with the understanding that the favor will be returned, there's an obligation there. Armed with this knowledge, I felt slightly more confident heading into our first mediation session. That confidence crumbled when I saw not just David and his attorney, but his parents as well. David's parents had always been cordial to me, if a bit distant. They came from money and had never fully approved of their son marrying someone from a middle-class background. Still, over 15 years, I thought we developed a respectful relationship. I was wrong. In that mediation room, I learned that they had paid for David's lawyer, one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the city. They had also, as it turned out, been advising him on how to structure his finances in the months before asking for the divorce, helping him shield assets from what they called excessive claims. The mediation was brutal. David's attorney portrayed me as someone who had willingly chosen not to advance my career, suggesting that my support during his education was simply what any spouse would do and created no special obligation. When my attorney argued that I had given up educational opportunities based on a specific agreement, David denied that any such agreement had existed. She chose to work those jobs, he said coldly. I never forced her to give up anything. 15 years of partnership reduced to this clinical dismissal. It felt like being erased. But the most painful moment came when David's mother spoke up, ostensibly to suggest a compromise. We understand that she's been part of David's life for many years, she said, not even looking at me directly. But let's be realistic about her contributions. She was essentially performing the duties that hired help would have, keeping the apartment, cooking meals, doing laundry. Those services have a market value, and it's not particularly high. Hired help. That's how she characterized 15 years of loving support, emotional labor, and financial contribution. I felt physically ill. My attorney squeezed my hand under the table and then calmly dismantled their arguments, pointing out that I had contributed not just household labor but actual financial support that enabled David to complete his education with minimal debt. She presented records of my income, our joint expenses, and calculations of what it would have cost David to hire the help his mother so dismissively referenced. The mediation ended without resolution, pushing us closer to court. Outside the conference room, David's father approached me. I thought perhaps he was going to offer some conciliatory word, some acknowledgement of my years with their son. Instead, he handed me a check. $10,000, he said quietly. Take it and agree to their terms. If you push this to court, we'll make sure you're portrayed as a gold digger who's trying to cash in on David's success. Think carefully about whether you want that to be your reputation. I handed the check back to him, my hand shaking with anger. I was family for 15 years, I said. Not staff. The case did go to court. The weeks leading up to the hearing were some of the darkest of my life. I was forced to continue working alongside the same people who now knew that my marriage was imploding spectacularly. Some offered sympathy, others watched with poorly disguised curiosity. I started having panic attacks and couldn't sleep. The future I had planned for so long was gone, and I didn't know what would replace it. Meanwhile, David and Melissa's relationship was progressing rapidly. Through mutual friends, I heard they were already engaged. The timeline suggested that their relationship had begun while he was still in fellowship, when I was still working to support him, still believing in our shared future. The court hearing was less dramatic than I had feared. The judge, a woman in her 60s, reviewed our case thoroughly. She seemed particularly interested in the timeline of our marriage, the financial records, and the specific understandings we had about our respective educational paths. David testified that while he appreciated my support during his education, there had never been a formal agreement that he would later support me through graduate school. He characterized it as a vague someday plan, not a concrete arrangement that had guided our major life decisions. When I took the stand, I described the specific conversations we'd had, the joint decision-making, and the repeated promises over the years that my turn would come. I explained how each time David extended his training, he had explicitly renewed the promise that he would support me afterward. I presented journals I'd kept, emails we'd exchanged discussing when you're done and I go back to school, and testimony from friends who had heard him acknowledge this plan. The judge ultimately ruled largely in my favor. She ordered significant spousal support for a period of 5 years, enough time, she noted, for me to complete a PhD program and establish myself professionally. She also awarded me a portion of the value of David's increased earning capacity, acknowledging that my financial contribution to his education and training entitled me to some of the returns on that investment. Outside the courtroom, I caught a glimpse of David's face. He looked stunned, as if it had never occurred to him that there would be consequences for discarding our agreement. His mother was whispering furiously to their attorney while his father stared stonily ahead. They didn't look at me as they left. That should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. David appealed the ruling, triggering another round of legal proceedings and emotional turmoil. During this time, I learned through the professional grapevine that he was telling colleagues I had trapped him in the marriage and was now extorting him. The narrative he was constructing painted him as the victim of a calculating woman who had always intended to profit from his success. Those who knew us as a couple knew better, but it still hurt to know that this was how he was recharacterizing our 15 years together. I wondered if he actually believed this version of events, if he had so thoroughly rewritten our history that he no longer remembered the truth of our partnership. The appeal dragged on for months, keeping me in limbo. I couldn't move forward with PhD applications because I didn't know if I would have the financial means to attend. I couldn't decide whether to stay in our city or move elsewhere because I didn't know what my circumstances would be. My life felt frozen while David and Melissa moved on with theirs, posting pictures of exotic vacations and their new luxury home on social media. Then, unexpectedly, David dropped the appeal. I never learned exactly why. Perhaps his attorney advised him that he was unlikely to succeed, or perhaps he finally recognized the optics of his behavior. All I knew was that suddenly, it was truly over. The court's original ruling would stand. With a legal battle behind me and financial support secured, I could finally begin rebuilding my life. I applied to PhD programs, was accepted to several, and ultimately chose one in a different state, somewhere I could have a fresh start, away from the whispers and sideways glances that followed me in the city where everybody knew I was Dr. Parker's ex-wife. As I packed up the apartment we had shared for so many years, I found myself reflecting on the wreckage of my marriage. I had given David the most productive years of my life, supported him through every step of his journey, celebrated his successes as if they were my own. In return, he had discarded me the moment I was no longer useful to him, replaced me with someone younger, and then fought to deny me the future he had promised. The betrayal wasn't just David's. It was also his parents, who had watched me devote myself to their son's success for 15 years and then coldly dismissed my contributions. It was the friends who chose sides and believed his narrative over mine. It was a system that so often fails to value the invisible labor that makes someone else's achievement possible. 3 years later, I'm halfway through my PhD program and finally building the career I put on hold for so long. The spousal support from David covers my basic expenses, allowing me to focus on my studies. I've published 2 academic articles and recently received a small grant to support my dissertation research. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I'm living my own dream rather than supporting someone else's. I still think about David sometimes, about what could drive someone to so completely rewrite the history of a 15-year partnership. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Melissa got married in an extravagant ceremony paid for by his parents. I've heard they're expecting their first child. I've heard he's become quite successful in his specialty. I don't wish him ill. The anger has faded over time, replaced by a kind of sad recognition that I never really knew him as well as I thought I did. Or perhaps the person I loved was consumed by ambition and status until there was nothing left of him. Recently, I received an unexpected letter. It was from David's younger sister, with whom I'd always been friendly but never particularly close. She wrote that she had distanced herself from her family after seeing how they treated me, that she had always been appalled by their behavior and her brother's callousness. She said she had tried to reason with them but had been shut down. She wanted me to know that not everyone in the family thought I was just the help. I cried when I read her words, not from lingering grief over the marriage, but from the simple relief of validation. After years of having my reality questioned and my contributions minimized, it meant everything to have someone who had witnessed it all acknowledge the truth. I won't say I've completely healed from the experience. There are still moments when insecurity creeps in, when I wonder if I wasted my youth, when I feel behind my peers who didn't put their lives on hold for someone else's dreams. Dating again has been challenging. I find myself watching for signs that I'm being used, that promises won't be kept, that I'm valued for what I can give rather than who I am. But I'm moving forward. My dissertation focuses on portrayals of sacrifice and betrayal in contemporary literature. Writing about my experience through the lens of literary analysis has been unexpectedly therapeutic. I've made new friends who know me only as I am now, not as half of a couple that imploded spectacularly. I've even started dating someone, a fellow academic who seems genuinely interested in my work and my thoughts. The most important lesson I've learned is that supporting someone else's dreams should never mean abandoning your own. I don't regret loving David or even supporting him through his training, but I regret not insisting that my goals were equally important, that the someday when I would pursue them couldn't be indefinitely deferred. To anyone reading this who recognizes elements of their own relationship, don't make the mistake I did. Don't wait for permission to pursue your own dreams. Don't trust promises about someday without concrete plans and actions to back them up. Your ambitions matter just as much as your partner's, and anyone who doesn't recognize that isn't truly your partner at all. As for me, I'll graduate with my PhD next year. I've already had interest from several universities about teaching positions. The future I deferred for so long is finally taking shape, and despite everything, I'm excited for what comes next. The life I'm building may not be the one I initially planned, but it's mine, and no one can take it away from me again.